The city of Birmingham was calm that Sunday evening. The orange glow of the setting sun fell across rows of red brick houses, their chimneys exhaling thin trails of smoke into the cooling air. Inside one of these homes, the Thompson family gathered around a polished oak table, set with steaming plates of roast potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, and thick slices of lamb. Laughter filled the dining room as Margaret Thompson, the mother, passed the gravy boat to her eldest son James. He was 27, tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy charm that often disarmed strangers. His father, Richard, watched proudly as the family shared stories from the week. The clinking of cutlery and warm voices created an atmosphere of comfort. For a while, it seemed as if nothing could disturb the peace of that moment. Then came the knock. It was not loud, yet it echoed strangely through the hallway. James put down his fork and glanced at his parents. Richard frowned, wondering who could be calling at this hour. James stood, walked to the door, and pulled it open. On the steps stood a girl. Her hair fell in loose waves around her face, her clothes were simple, and her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. She looked no more than 16. For a moment, silence lingered between them, broken only by the faint hum of the street outside. Then, with a trembling voice, the girl asked the words that would change everything. "Are you my dad?" The sound of her question traveled down the hallway, reaching the dining room where Margaret and Richard froze. James felt the blood drain from his face as the weight of those words settled into the heart of the Thompson household. James stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still gripping the handle. The girl's words echoed in his mind. Behind him, his mother's chair scraped against the wooden floor as she rose in alarm. "Who is it, James?" Margaret called, her voice sharp with unease. James could not answer. His eyes were locked on the stranger who looked back at him with a mixture of fear and determination. Finally, he stepped aside, and the girl moved hesitantly into the hallway. Richard appeared at the dining room door. He was a man who carried authority in his presence, yet at that moment his face betrayed confusion. His gaze swept over the girl, studying her as though searching for some clue in her features. The girl clasped her hands together, trying to steady her breathing. "My name is Emily," she whispered, her voice breaking. I think you are my father." A heavy silence fell upon the Thompson household. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide. James shook his head slowly. He knew it was impossible. He had never been with anyone who could have left behind a daughter of that age. But the certainty in Emily's expression unsettled him. She was not here by mistake. Richard's throat tightened. His jaw clenched as he looked from James to Emily and back again. Margaret's eyes darted to her husband, suspicion beginning to bloom in her mind. The warmth of Sunday dinner had vanished, replaced by the cold grip of doubt. And within that silence, an unspoken question hung heavily in the air. Who was Emily, and why had she come to their door? Emily stood awkwardly in the hallway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her small worn bag. The house smelled of roasted meat and gravy, but she seemed too nervous to notice. James closed the door behind her, his thoughts racing. Margaret guided Emily into the sitting room, her face pale yet composed. The girl sat on the edge of the sofa, her back straight as if preparing for a trial. Richard remained standing near the fireplace, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and dread. James cleared his throat. "Emily, there must be some mistake. I cannot be your father. I am too young." Emily's lips trembled. She looked at him, then at Richard, and finally back again. "I was told to come here, to this house, to this family. And I was told that the man who lives here is my father." The words struck Richard like a hammer. His hands curled into fists at his sides, though his expression barely changed. Margaret noticed the flicker in his eyes, a flicker she had seen only a handful of times in their marriage. It was the look of a man hiding something. James felt the tension thicken in the air. His heart pounded as he tried to think. Who had told her to come here? Why this address? Emily hesitated before speaking again. "My mother," she said. His name was Richard. The silence that followed was unbearable. Margaret's face drained of color, her gaze snapping towards her husband. James's breath caught as he turned slowly to his father. Richard did not move, but his eyes betrayed him. In that single moment, everyone in the room knew the truth was far more complicated than they had imagined. Richard lowered himself into the armchair with the weight of a man carrying decades of secrets. His eyes avoided Margaret's piercing stare. James stood rigid, as though the walls themselves might close in on him. Emily's voice was small, but it carried a knife's edge. "My mother's name is Anna." The sound of it struck Richard like a blow. Margaret caught the twitch in his jaw, the slight widening of his eyes. She knew her husband well enough to read that reaction. James looked from his father to Emily, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Who is Anna?" he demanded. Richard clasped his hands together tightly. For a long moment he said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, filling the silence. Finally he spoke. "She was someone from my past. Before I married your mother." The words fell into the room like stones into a still pond. Margaret stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She told me," Emily whispered, "that when I was old enough, I should find you, that you needed to know I exist." James's head spun. His father's past had never been spoken of in detail, and now that past had walked into their home, living and breathing. Margaret rose slowly, her face set in steel. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "what have you done?" The atmosphere in the Thompson home grew colder with each passing second. Margaret paced the room, her anger rising. James stood torn between disbelief and fury, his fists clenching at his sides. "You never told me," Margaret hissed. "All these years, and you never said a word about this, Anna. About a child." Richard's voice was low. "I did not know. She never told me there was a child." Emily's gaze shifted between them, fear creeping into her chest. She had not come here to cause destruction, yet destruction unfolded before her eyes. James turned on his father. "So, is it true? Is she your daughter?" Richard's eyes closed briefly. If Anna said so, then perhaps she is. The confession hung in the air. Margaret gasped, her hand gripping the armrest of the sofa for support. James shook his head in disbelief, the image of his father crumbling before him. Emily stared at the floor, ashamed, as if her very presence was poison. "I am sorry," she murmured. "I should not have come." But the truth was out now, and no one could return to the peace they once knew. Later that night, when the air had grown heavy with silence, Emily reached into her bag. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. She held it out towards Richard. "My mother wrote this for you. She said you would understand." Richard hesitated, then took the letter with unsteady fingers. The room waited as he opened it. His eyes moved across the page, his face tightening with every line. Margaret tried to read his expression, but Richard turned away, shielding the paper from view. James took a step closer. "What does it say?" Richard lowered the letter slowly, his voice heavy. "She wrote that Emily is mine. That she never told me because she feared what it would do to my life. And now she is gone." Emily's tears slipped down her cheeks. "She died 2 months ago." The revelation struck like thunder. Margaret covered her mouth, and James stared at Emily with new eyes. She was not just a stranger. She was the last living reminder of a woman his father once loved. And she had nowhere else to go. Richard sat in silence, the letter clutched in his hand. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth a cruel contrast to the chill that seeped into the family's bones. James struggled with the storm inside him. Part of him pitied the girl, yet another part raged against the betrayal that had reshaped his family. Margaret's voice broke the silence. "What are we to do with her, Richard?" Richard looked at Emily, her small frame curled into the corner of the sofa. He saw her mother's eyes in her face, memories long buried rushing back. "She is no one," he said. "She is my responsibility now." Margaret's face hardened. "Your responsibility? Do you realize what you are asking of me? To raise the child of another woman." James could not bear the sight of Emily's tears. He turned away, yet her sobs carved themselves into his heart. The family had been whole that very afternoon. Now it stood divided, and the bond of blood threatened to tear them apart. That night, the house was filled with silence broken only by restless footsteps and muffled voices. James lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. The echo of Emily's words haunted him. Unable to sleep, he walked to the landing. Below, in the sitting room, the soft sound of weeping reached his ears. Emily sat alone by the dying fire, her shoulders shaking. For a moment, James hesitated. Then he descended quietly and stood in the doorway. "You should not be alone," he said softly. Emily looked up, startled. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears. "I do not belong here," she whispered. "I have ruined everything." James's chest tightened. He sat opposite her, the firelight flickering across his troubled face. "You did not ask to be born. You are not to blame for what happened years ago." Emily's lip quivered. "Then why does it feel like everyone hates me?" James could not answer. He only knew that something inside him shifted that night. She was not his enemy. She was his sister, whether he liked it or not. The next day brought no peace. Margaret avoided Richard, her silence louder than anger. James moved through the house like a stranger, while Emily kept to herself, afraid of causing more harm. By evening, the storm finally broke. Margaret confronted Richard in the kitchen, her voice rising in fury. "All these years I believed in you. And now you expect me to live with the proof of your betrayal under my roof." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "It was before you, Margaret. I did not know. You cannot punish me for something I never chose." Their voices carried through the house. Emily covered her ears, trembling. James stormed in, his face flushed. "Enough," he shouted. "This is not about the past. This is about now." "About her." He pointed to Emily, who stood frozen in the doorway. "She is here, and she needs us." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. For the first time, Richard, Margaret, and James all looked at Emily not as a stranger, but as the fragile heart of their fractured family. The days that followed were uneasy, filled with cautious words and hesitant glances. Margaret moved with cold politeness, Richard with quiet guilt, and James with growing protectiveness. Emily remained uncertain, her presence like a shadow that would not fade. Yet slowly, a change began to take root. One evening, as the family sat once again at the dining table, the silence was broken not by anger, but by the soft sound of Emily's voice. "Thank you," she whispered. The words startled them, yet they carried a fragile hope. James met her eyes and nodded. Margaret hesitated, then placed a slice of bread gently onto Emily's plate. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And in that small act, the Thompson family began a new chapter of their story, one marked not by certainty, but by the slow, painful birth of acceptance.